The main kind of fighting that was occurring over the course of hours throughout the afternoon of the 19th of September in 1777. And I briefly talked about the fighting that was going on in the woods and the fields to our west. But now it's time to turn our attention to the east. You'll remember I mentioned that there was a British regiment down there on the cultivated open ground, the 20th Regiment of Foot. They're stationed out there, and they're not really engaged so much for much of the early parts of the battle that were taking place up here on the hill and to the areas west of here. However, unfortunately for them, they're about to be engaged because they start getting shot at by riflemen. The riflemen are back. Remember Daniel Morgan's Corps of Riflemen? They had been scattered early in the combat. Well, Morgan was able to get his men back together. He commands about 400 riflemen. They're from Virginia, Pennsylvania, with a peppering of Marylanders, and it's a cohesive battalion of about 400 Continental soldiers. They were specifically selected, drawn out of their parent regiments because of their rifle prowess and sobriety. It's a thing. It was there in the order. So they're formed in the woods. According to one account, the guy who wrote about it mentioned that Morgan's scattered men were about half a mile south of the woodline on the south side of Freeman's farm. So you can imagine them about a half a mile south of that woodline. They're finally together, and then at some point in the battle, they are going to march through the woods, and over into this area here. In the woods. So they're in the woods. You wouldn't be able to see them if they were here today. Oh, I guess you could, because there were canopy trees that we're talking about. But if they were here right now, you wouldn't be able to see them because of all the shrubbery. So because the British had advanced so far south, particularly the 62nd Regiment and that 21st Regiment, the riflemen were north of them. The riflemen, some of them noticed that they could take shots at the backs of the Royal Artillerymen and some of the British Redcoats that were fighting against the New Hampshire Continentals and the Connecticut Militia. And so the 20th Regiment, they start getting shot at as well from the riflemen. And so Lieutenant Colonel Lind, a guy again who's never commanded a battalion in battle in his life, he is going to order his battalion, about 400 officers and men, to Morgan's 400, so the numbers are about equal, right? They go into the woods. Now, I wish we could have this as part of our tour, but if we were to go down there, you'd see it for yourself because it's still there to this day. You go into the woods, and there is a very deep ravine. You wouldn't think it because it looks like a happy kind of flat wood, like, you know, with no crevices and ravines. Oh, but there is. There's a couple of successive ravines in the woods, and they were let's say, parallel. They ran parallel, these ravines, to the 20th Regiment of Foot advance. So the 20th Regiment's advancing south like this, and these ravines are in the woods in that same direction, right? So in other words, every single officer and soldier, in order to get at the riflemen, of course the riflemen are south of the ravines, the 20th Regiment would have to go into the ravines. And it just so happens that they tried, and if you were to go there, you'd see how deep they are. It's ridiculous. They're you know, I don't know, 10, let's say 8, 9 feet deep. These ravines, you'd have to tumble down the ravine. They're very steep. Then you'd have to claw up the other side with your musket, and all the while you're being shot at by riflemen. You know, it would have been perilous if you were in this regiment trying to get at the riflemen on the other side. And then for those few lucky or unlucky people who were able to make it across these two ravines, these successive ravines, they found an abattis waiting for them. An abattis is a fortification element in which, let's say, cut down a tree such as this one right over there, that scraggy tree, have it cut down, you would take a bunch of the branches and then you would place the upward pointing branches in the direction of the enemy advance. So you can get up these two ravines all you want, but then you're going to encounter just this mess of brush, tree branches and everything. And it's not like you're going to be impaled on these branches, but you have to get through them as best you can to just get at the riflemen, who of course are shooting at you. They're from behind trees. They're up in the trees as well. And so the 20th Regiment doesn't have a chance. They're going to withdraw out of the woods. They get back onto their field. It doesn't seem that they tried it a second time. And as the course of the battle wore on, they were redeployed to fight up here on the hilltop to support the 62nd Regiment. The 20th Regiment of foot was eviscerated for their attempt to attack the riflemen. They really paid for it dearly, quite dearly. So it's at the end of the day. It's approaching 7 o'clock. The battle looks like it's going to be in the Americans' favor, our favor, right? It looks like we are going to be victorious because clearly, just by a visual, observation, we find that the British Redcoats have way more casualties than our own troops. But who gets reinforcements? That's the question. Both sides tried to get reinforcements. Benedict Arnold wanted more. So he went back to camp. He goes to Gates, who's in camp, directing things from the camp, directing the defenses, which don't come under attack during the battle. And so Arnold says to Gates, we don't know the exact quote, but we know that according to one eyewitness who wrote about it shortly thereafter, Arnold applied for reinforcements from Gates. And Gates said, no, I will send no more. As it was, Arnold had sent every single one of his own troops. Arnold commands half of the army present at Bemis Heights, a little less than half of the army present at Bemis Heights. He sent every single one of them that he could. He now was asking Horatio Gates if he could send some of the troops under his direct command. Gates says no. According to the guy who was standing right there, he said that Arnold pressed a second time for reinforcements. He was determined to get help for his troops that were winning the battle. They just needed that extra push. And Gates said no and drew out his sword on Arnold and said that he, this is in the third person, that he, meaning Gates, is the commander of the army and would be obeyed as such. That put an end to the question of reinforcements for Arnold. No reinforcements would be forthcoming for Arnold and the troops fighting here in the battle. But what about the British? Do they have that kind of problem? Well, I guess this is where the advantage of having the commander of the army, General Burgoyne, on the field comes into play, because he doesn't have to ask anybody for reinforcements. He's going to make them come. So he is going to send a fast rider down to the Hudson River, and he is going to relay a message for General Riedesel, and he's going to say, hey, from Burgoyne, the message is, hey, Riedesel, secure everything down by the river, all the boats, the provisions, the women and children, everything, make sure everything's safe, and bring up as many troops as you can to Freeman's Farm immediately. We need to bulk up our line to fight the rebels and win this battle. And that's exactly what Riedesel does. Actually, Riedesel, he had been already staging for such an opportunity. He had already prepared much of this in advance in anticipation of a potential request for reinforcements, because he knew that this battle was going on all afternoon, and the battle was pretty stationary. It's not like the battle was heading on south and with the British victories after victories, and then the battle's going on south of here at the Bemis Heights camp. No, the battle is stationary here, which cannot be good for the British forces, Riedessel's thinking. And so he's like staging his forces for a potential reinforcement. And here comes the time. Now it's time for that reinforcement. And so here they come, somewhere between 7 and 7:30, about 750 German soldiers, Braunschweigers and Hessians, proper Hessians from Hessen-Hanau. They're going to come upon the field on the eastern side of the clearing. 700 infantrymen are immediately from there sent into the woods to traverse those ravines and outflank the riflemen. The riflemen were not in the area where the Germans were traversing. So now you had Germans through the woods coming at the flank of the riflemen. The riflemen had no choice but to retreat. It's getting to be night. The riflemen are running low on ammunition. Now they're being outflanked by approaching twice their number. The riflemen had to retreat. As for the Hessians, they got some cannons with them, 2 of those 6-pounders, just like you saw over there, that one in the middle, the bigger one. They have 2 of those. Now they got fresh cannons with more ammunition. They bring up they drag up by manpower. They don't actually have the horses do this because the first casualties of battle are horses. And they don't want to have that happen here. So they're going to drag up the cannons up the hilltop after they detach the horses. They drag them up to this very hilltop, the southern height, and they're going to shoot their cannons at the Americans, who were then had been starting to advance, but then melted back into the darkened woods. It was late in the day. The battle had ended. The battle was over, and the British forces were victorious.
That's crazy.
Yeah, so General Fraser and his column had been fighting against Americans over to the west of us. They were not here. They were fighting Americans over to the west of us, and they beat the Americans there too. The American forces all went back to their camp. So by the rules of war, you win a battle if you hold the field of battle. So like Bunker Hill, the British won the Battle of Bunker Hill in June of 1775, right? They won the battle, but they lost way more than the Americans did in that battle. What about here in the Battle of Freeman's Farm? The British won the Battle of Freeman's Farm because they held the field. But what about casualties? Well, the British forces suffered 550 killed and or wounded. And many of those wounded were mortally wounded. They died of their wounds. They lost about 40 more to captivity. Americans were able to capture about 40 British officers and soldiers during the course of the battle. So approaching 600 casualties all told. For the Americans, they lost 300 killed and or wounded, and another 20 were in the hands of the British as prisoners of war. It's the British who had the task of burying all of the dead from the Battle of Freeman's Farm, friend and foe alike. Many of those who had been wounded, the Americans, they had been brought back to camp during the course of the battle, and they, some of them died almost right away. Some of them had surgeries and they died from the surgery. This monument here, if you want to take a look, is a monument to a captain of the Connecticut Militia, Cook's Regiment. Remember that Connecticut Militia reinforcement that came up early in the battle and fought in that tree line right over there? Thaddeus Cook. He was from Connecticut, and he was very severely wounded. According to various accounts, a cannon, like a piece of case shot, again that 3/4 of an inch ball, a piece of case shot hit his leg and shore it right off. And he was wounded. He wasn't killed, but he was brought back to camp, and they operated on him, further amputations, but he died sometime later. He died at the camp in Beams Heights, where he's still buried to this day, near where the hospital was, which is just south of stop number 2. As for those who were buried here from the battle, British and American alike, they're also still buried here. They really are. We don't know exactly where the British buried them, because the British buried everybody here. We don't know exactly where they buried them. They didn't map it out. They didn't tell us. They didn't make little headstones or anything like that, even for their officers, the British officers who had lost their lives. But hundreds of men and boys are buried out here on Freeman's Farm and the adjoining farm field and within the woods. If you were with me last year and you had seen my presentation about casualties in the Battle of Freeman's Farm, it's a long-term project I'm working on. If we look at the American Army, just the American forces, militia and continental, and we divide up those who died, not even just wounded, just those who died, and you divide them up by decade of age, meaning teenagers, 20-somethings, 30-somethings, 40-somethings, 50-somethings, 60-somethings, the plurality of death occurred amongst the teenagers. I kid you not. And you can next is the 20-somethings, then the 30-somethings, 40s, 50s, and then one man in his 60s who wasn't killed here, but he died as a result of his service here. But the plurality of deaths occurred amongst those who were teenagers. And indeed, there were many, many, many young people who fought here in the battles of Saratoga and paid for it with their lives. And they weren't all young, of course, but many, many were. I just briefly, very briefly, I promise, want to go through a couple of names here. There was a private soldier by the name of Henry Trowbridge. Henry Trowbridge was from Colchester, Connecticut. He was 19 years old. We know from the family genealogy that he was living at home with his parents and 5 siblings. He had been called up to serve in the Connecticut militia. He fought here in the Battle of Freeman's Farm. He was one of those killed in his regiment, a 19-year-old boy, and he was buried here somewhere on Freeman's Farm. Then we have an example of a man named Prince Douglas. He came from Hancock, Massachusetts. He was an enslaved man. We don't know exactly how he came to serve in the Continental Army. There were a couple ways by which enslaved men could join the Continental Army, but he was in Colonel Bailey's Continental Regiment, a Massachusetts Continental Regiment, and he was killed here in the Battle of Freeman's Farm, buried here too, somewhere. Again, we don't know where, but Prince Douglas is buried here. And here is Eleazar Gove. He was from Seabrook, New Hampshire, 45 years old. He had a wife named Mary and 5 children. He was killed here in the Battle of Freeman's Farm while serving with that 3rd New Hampshire Regiment, that reinforcement that came up during the course of the battle. Those are just 3 quick examples of the kinds of variety of people, kids, enslaved people, fathers who were killed here. It's interesting when you look at the military records. If you're looking at casualties, right, they'll give you like the casualty list for the First Battle of Saratoga. They'll give you numbers of by rank, by regiment, you know, they'll give you numbers, but they don't give you names, except the officers. They mention them by name, but not the soldiers. So then you have to go to the muster rolls that were made after the battles of Saratoga, and then you can look at the name and, oh, killed September 19th. Now we have a name. Then you look in the genealogy to find out, well, how old was that guy? Was he married? Did he have kids, et cetera, et cetera? And so by marrying these various military documents and the genealogical information, the kinds of stories, horribly sad stories that come out of it are unending, truly. And like I said, it's a very long work in progress, but the stories that come out of it are just tremendous. Yeah. So the battle's over, the British win. Kind of a downer, right? Except for the man wearing the, where is he? Yes, the GR broad arrow cap. He's happy that the British won. But otherwise, all of us are unhappy. I'm kidding. I had to point it out somehow. If you're wondering, the little arrow that he has on his hat, that's called the King's Mark. You'll find that on all British ordnance-owned military equipment like haversacks, cannons, etc. And the GR stands for Georgius Rex, Latin for King George. So you know he's British. So thank you so much for coming on the tour of Freeman's Farm. Really appreciate you coming today. And thank you, Weather, for holding up for us. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, of course. If anybody has any questions at all, or you want to talk a little bit more about the battle, because I skipped over a lot of details. This might have been the 3-hour tour I was threatening, but I promise there's a lot more to the fight that I didn't talk about. So if you'd like, oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.
Another one here.
Okay.
Are you doing this next month for battle number 2?
Yes, sir.
All right.
I will. I will indeed.
Next month.
You're
Do
welcome.
you know how many reinforcements?
There'll be a video on YouTube tonight
That's the last one.
for this whole tour. So if somebody in the family missed it,
were not sent?
just look up Freeman's
You
Farm
know, how many did they have in
and you'll see it
Oh,
there.
yeah. So when we look at the Northern Army, you know, Leonard's Brigade, Poor's Brigade, and the Morgan's Corps, Riflemen and Light Infantry. Then with Gates, you have the other portion of the Army, which is Nixon's Brigade, Patterson's Brigade, and Glover's Brigade, each of which had 4 continental regiments. And then Glover's Brigade